Or maybe not learned enough, maybe not yet. Welcome to the last, but certainly not the least session of this first day of the Common Good Summit. My name is Thuy-Diep Nguyen. I'm co-editor-in-chief at Challenge magazine in Paris, and I'm really, really happy to host this debate around a crucial topic. Welcome, Michael. Michael Kremer is with us today. Hello, Michael.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Hi. Thank you so much for being with us. I know you're in Germany, if my infos are correct, near Bonn, I think. I know you absolutely wanted to be with us, but your schedule was a little bit too tight, so thank you again. Michael, in a nutshell, you are a development economist from the University of Chicago. Among other awards, you share the 2019 Nobel Prize of Economics Award with Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, our local star, a woman. And your work was on alleviating global poverty, reducing global poverty. Over the years, you've worked on mostly on the theme of innovation linked to health issues, to education, to water supply, to agriculture and finance. How do we fund social innovation? In the past, you've also worked on vaccines. Your work has contributed to a new pneumococcal vaccine, which is, as most people know, one of the leading causes of infant mortality in the world. And your work also helped out to roll out this vaccine in over 60 developing countries. So since 2019, nobody will be surprised to learn that, of course, you've also worked on COVID, the COVID pandemic, how to make a vaccine, how to make things better, faster, how to make things work better, advanced market commitments, and maybe, who knows, maybe tomorrow on COVID treatments. So I'm going to leave the floor to you for 10, 15 minutes. But Michael, how can we get ready for the next big one? Because we know there will be a next big one. How can we ensure to have more resilient health systems, more resilient economic systems that in the end will probably help save lives, save time, and save money? It's all yours. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. I think there are many important lessons to be taken from the COVID-19 pandemic, and that we can take some lessons on ways we could reduce the risk and the severity of future public health crises, and all the dimensions of risk that you spoke of, the risks to human health, the broader social and economic and educational risks or costs. First, let me just emphasize how enormous these costs of the COVID-19 pandemic are, and why it's really imperative that we try to take steps to learn from it and to try to reduce both the likelihood and the burden created by the next time. So a conservative estimate of the global cost of COVID-19 is around $36 trillion. Now, where does that come from? Well, if we take let's use the IMF estimate of just the short-run GDP cost of COVID, they estimated $13.8 trillion. Okay, now, but some of the, interestingly, the long-run costs are likely to be much larger, or significantly larger than the costs that we've already incurred. And why is that? Well, COVID-19 led to many school closures around the world. Now, I understand that in France they're fairly short run, but in some places children have been out of school for years. And if you're talking about low or middle income economies, those children may never go back to school. And so based on some evidence from other school disruptions, the World Bank estimates a loss of productivity and future earnings due to COVID-19 of $10 to $17 trillion. So, from slightly under to slightly over the immediate short-run GDP costs. And then, of course, there are the health costs. And it's philosophically obviously very difficult to put a dollar value on a statistical life, but there in health economics, people do this. And again, you get another enormous figure added. And this is just based on the deaths, not even counting the mental health costs or just the human suffering costs. So you very quickly get to a number like $36 trillion. So anything that we can do to try to prevent this from occurring, or to try to reduce the severity if it does occur, or to shorten the time period, is just hugely valuable. And I think there are, I can be quantitative about that in a bit, as economists tend to want to be. The
That's your
but
job.
let me just first note that there are many different things that we need to do to try to do this, and this ranges from. I'm going to focus primarily on vaccines because that's the issue I've worked on, but I don't mean to neglect the other parts of the problem. Developing treatments more quickly, developing diagnostics, trying to learn more about what non-pharmaceutical interventions, things like masking, social distancing, school closures, which of those are actually effective against the disease, and which ones are less effective and perhaps more costly to society through, as I believe, school closings were extended school closings. Trying to learn more about that, I think, and learn more quickly the next time is going to be very important. There's other things like surveillance so that we can identify if there are diseases that might be leading to outbreaks and stop things before they spread. There's thinking about how we can better design economic systems to provide support in if there is a crisis like this. How do we thinking about education systems? How can we reduce some of these educational costs or mental health costs of the pandemic? So I won't focus on these because I know less about them, but I do think that these are all very important components. But turning to vaccines, let me note that the estimated chance of a pandemic. Obviously, this is a matter of some debate, but it's estimated at 2% annual chance. So if you think about this cost of 36 trillion, and you break that down, how much should we expect the cost to be every year? Well, it's in the range of $700 billion a year. So that is just the expected costs of this, multiplying that number by 2%. So when you have numbers that big for the cost, some decisions that we might not do otherwise might start to make sense. So, in particular, I'll argue that it makes sense to have a large amount of vaccine manufacturing capacity installed so that if we do get another pandemic, then we can move very quickly from having candidate vaccines to being able to, in parallel, and I think this is something that to some extent the world did well during COVID, to some extent we didn't do enough, is trying to make multiple investments in parallel. So normally, pharmaceutical companies wait until they have some positive evidence on a candidate vaccine before they start producing it in very large scale. And that's because it can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build a plant. And most vaccines actually fail. In a way, we were lucky with COVID and how many succeeded. But you can imagine from a purely commercial point of view, it might seem that it makes sense to wait to see whether the vaccine's actually going to succeed before building the plant at commercial scale or at very large scale. But in this type of pandemic situation, or if there's a risk of that, then the benefits of it's worth taking basically it's worth taking the risks of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a plant that for a vaccine that might not succeed, when the alternative is costs of this magnitude. And that's true in work we did early in the pandemic, we did our calculations assuming there'd only be about a 5% chance that a typical vaccine would succeed. But we found that despite that, it was completely worthwhile doing this, just because of that 5% chance, plus the possibility that you would accelerate the availability of vaccine. The In fact, we recommended that this be done for many vaccines, many candidate vaccines. Now, one effort to do this, and just to make this very concrete, the Operation Warp Speed in the United States basically signed a bunch of contracts to pay for factories to be built early on before it was known whether the vaccines would work. That cost $13 billion, so not a small sum of money in the amounts we normally think about it. But given these tremendous costs of the pandemic, it would have paid for itself if it accelerated vaccination by just 12 hours. So now I'll come back to some issues around Operation Warp Speed and the fact that that was done for the United States and rather than for the world. But I think this calculation suggests that the aim in the future should be to try to make sure that this is available for the whole world, rather than to say let's not make the investments. The investments were very good. There's a question of how do we structure things so that the entire world can benefit from it. I think that's actually it's a much easier challenge going forward when we're thinking about prevention of the next pandemic or mitigating the effects of the next pandemic than it was for COVID. Okay. What caused, we faced many shortages in the case of COVID. There were shortages of just factory capacity. There were also shortages of inputs, things like you need bioreactors to manufacture the vaccine in. You need lipid particles. There are things called adjuvants that go into vaccine. Those were in short supply. Now, in a situation where you have shortages, there are very strong incentives for countries to impose trade restrictions and hoard vaccines. And we saw these trade restrictions imposed by many countries. The United States imposed them, India imposed them. I think we can try to make moral appeals to politicians to not put in those restrictions, but it's very hard to overcome the natural incentives, and some would argue the responsibility of politicians, of democratically elected politicians, to serve the people who elected them and to prioritize them first, and to try and get vaccines, if there's a shortage, to try to get vaccines to them first. I think a better strategy, rather than hoping that in the next pandemic, political leaders are going to be more globally minded. I think a better strategy is to try to change the incentives that politicians are facing. And the best way to do that is by investing in advance to create sufficient standby production capacity for vaccines and sufficient standby input availability, stockpiles, so that we have sufficient supplies available. And if those are available, then the incentives to impose trade restrictions are much weaker. That sounds very theoretical and very hypothetical, but in fact, we saw this with masks, for example, personal protective equipment. Very early in the pandemic, many countries put trade restrictions on export of masks. As soon as supply adjusted, and it was possible to ramp up supply of this much more quickly, the problem stopped, and countries were not keeping these export restrictions on. So I think one lesson is, let's try to get a lot of capacity in line, and that doesn't just mean the factory capacity and the stockpiles of inputs. It also means the human resources, the quality control systems, everything else, and that has a real cost. If you have a lot of workers who are if you have the factories, if you have the workers, and those are on standby, that could cost a few $1 billion a year. But spending a few $1 billion a year when the expected cost, the 2% chance times the cost if we do have another pandemic the size of COVID, that is $700 billion a year. This is an extremely good investment by by even the narrowest cost benefit terms. So one is having the production capacity available. The second thing is better systems for research and development. So there are many, and trying to do some of that R&D now. So there's been discussion of having a universal COVID vaccine, universal coronavirus vaccine that would work against a whole strain of different coronaviruses.
Do you believe in
things
that?
that would work.
Do you believe in that?
Yes.
The universal coronavirus vaccine?
So I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to be the one to judge whether that's feasible or not. Let me outline two possible strategies that could be taken. One is the public sector could say, if you ask me now, and if the only alternative were either we invest in this or we don't, I would say let's invest in it. We don't know whether that's going to work, but if there's a small chance that it works, this is like a little bit like, do we want a fire department? Well, we don't know if there'll be a fire, and we don't know if our fire department will succeed in fighting the fire if we have a fire. But still, we decide to have fire departments. I think there's a natural tendency to think, well, let's be conservative. Let's not risk wasting any money. But that's not the appropriate way to think about this. These are investments that reduce. They're not going to eliminate, but they reduce these huge risks that we're facing. They're very worthwhile, and I've been a little bit. I've been putting things in very cold economic terms because people may not respond sufficiently to just the health consequences. But even in cold economic terms, these are clearly, it's worth these investments with only a small probability of success. So if I were a government official and had to decide today, do I invest or not, I would certainly invest. Now, but another approach would be to tell companies that it's your decision whether you take the scientific risk of investing, but if you produce something, we're going to pay for it. And then leave that risk with the firms. But of course, you'll need to pay more if you're asking them to take on that risk rather than funding the costs up front. Either alternative could be pursued here.
Michael, how do you structure all this between getting a lot of money, the $13 billion you mentioned from the warp, fast, cross countries, and making sure everybody gets vaccinated? What would be your solution? Should it be multilateral?
So I think there are substantial gains from doing this multilaterally. And I'll explain again, I'm going to explain, I think there's all sorts of perhaps moral and ethical reasons for doing this multilaterally, but I agree with many of those reasons, but I'm just going to give I'm an economist, so let me give a narrow economic argument why that makes sense. If you think about a fire department, we don't each build a fire department for our own house. That would be very expensive, and maybe we have a fire extinguisher for our house, but we're not going to build a whole fire department for our house. And usually, when a fire hits, it hits some parts of the city, not all parts of the city. So one fire department can handle most emergencies, if not the worst types of citywide fires that we used to have historically. We don't see so much anymore. If we think about what do we need to prepare for the next pandemic, well, if we have a multilateral system, then not only can we, let me start with the most likely case. We've seen many cases like Zika, like Ebola, of diseases that are epidemics, but that are locally concentrated. So you could say, well, we'll invest very heavily in enough, and then we will use that wherever it's most needed. And then you could do other things where you say, well, some expenses like fire extinguishers, we'll do those everywhere. So I personally think it would be worth building enough coronavirus capacity, vaccine capacity for the whole world if we had a universal coronavirus. But there might be some other things that we think are smaller risks where we'd only have enough capacity, until we ramped it up for some part of the world. So I think there are advantages to doing it multilaterally. But let me draw a big distinction between, I mentioned that Operation Warp Speed was controversial. Why was it controversial? It was controversial because some people felt that there was a limited supply available in the short run, and if the U.S. contracted for that supply, it wouldn't be available to others. Now, in the short run, it's very difficult to rapidly increase supply in the short run. In the long run, if we're thinking about preparing for the next pandemic, if we're thinking about building our fire department, well, we can go build fire engines. We can go build capacity and keep it on standby. And one country doing that doesn't interfere with another country doing that, because we can build out, with time, we can build out sufficient capacity for everybody. So I would not be, if some countries decide that let's say that I'm in Germany now. Let's say that Germany decided, well, we want to build our own national capacity here in Germany because we're not sure we can count on anybody else. Well, that's not hurting anybody else. And I would argue there are actually some benefits, because it might well be that the next epidemic is localized and it affects Japan and it doesn't affect Germany. Well, then Germany might be willing to share some of the resources that it has available. So I would argue that we shouldn't be at all opposed to national efforts, to EU-wide efforts, but I think the most efficient thing would be to have a global effort. And certainly we need some global effort on behalf of low and middle income countries, because they have very pressing health needs right now. They're drinking, many people are drinking contaminated water. It's very cheap to treat that water, but it's not all being treated. I'm not sure. I could understand from a low income country point of view, they might say, look, we want to focus on the huge health needs we have now. But from a world point of view, it's actually in our interest in high income countries to have some control of infectious disease in lower and middle income countries, because to prevent the emergence of new variants, which might then spread to high income countries. So it's in the interest of high income countries to pay for some supplies for low income countries for these pandemic situations.
Michael, how do you avoid vaccine nationalism? Is this a risk for you?
It certainly is a risk, and that was one of the things that we saw with the COVID pandemic. I think it's very dangerous, and it's not just very dangerous because for the rest of the world, but it's very dangerous for the countries that pursue vaccine nationalism. So let me rewind history a little bit. Think back to the beginning of the pandemic. We didn't know, there were various technological approaches. You could go with traditional ways of manufacturing vaccine in bulk. You could go with what's called viral vector approaches. You could go with the newest and most untested approach, mRNA vaccines. The capacity to do this differed in different regions of the world. We didn't know which would work. Well, China invested in certain types of vaccine. The US invested in primarily in mRNA vaccines. This worked out very well for the US, but it could have gone the other way. And we're seeing the danger of the nationalistic approach right now in China. China decided they were going to go with their own vaccines. Now they have a large population which has doesn't have the best vaccines, and that leaves them vulnerable to a new to the epidemic, and that means that they're pursuing this zero COVID strategy with huge economic and social costs. And this isn't a point about China. This is a point about all of us. If China and the I would argue neither China nor the U.S., these two enormous economies, neither of us can count on our own vaccine working. We got lucky with mRNA vaccines. China got unlucky that they developed vaccines, but they're not as highly effective. If you think about any smaller economic unit, Australia pursued its own vaccine and that didn't work out. We all need a much better strategy is to have worldwide capacity sufficient to serve the whole globe, and then to have that capacity with several different technologies. There's some redundancy there, there's some costs, but those costs are tiny relative to both the human, the economic, and the social costs of pandemics.
Two questions, Michael. I don't know if you read Bill Gates' book on how to prevent the next pandemic, maybe, maybe not, whatever. He suggests public, private, international partnerships. What do you think of that? And second question, how do you manage vaccine ownership and patents in all this?
Right. Let me talk about my general take on intellectual property here, and then how it applies to vaccines in particular. I think we have two very important goals in society. That one is to develop new innovations throughout the economy, but in health they're very important, and they prove to be critical in the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic would have been much worse without the mRNA vaccines. So it's very good that we developed that. But the other goal is to make sure that when we develop these tools, that they're available to everybody who needs them. And right now, our current way of creating incentives for research and development, intellectual property, patents, and unfortunately creates a trade-off between these two very important goals. And I think we can modify that system to avoid that trade-off. I'm not saying this is magic and that we achieve both goals for free. It costs something, but these goals are important enough that they're worth paying for. So let me be specific and talk about advanced market commitments, which you mentioned earlier. The idea of an advanced market commitment is that if there's some technology which is needed, and if we can describe that technology in advance, if we have a procedure for seeing whether the technological needs have been met, and if we have some idea of understanding how much vaccine we would need, or how much of the product we would need, then it may make sense for governments to just declare in advance, to make a commitment that if a product is developed which meets the technical specifications, and if it's available at a certain price, and if it's produced in a certain quantity, they'll help finance the purchase of it. And in particular, the purchase of a sufficient quantity to serve everybody who needs it. That approach that avoids pitting these two goals against each other. You both create incentives for the product development, but instead of rewarding the inventor with only a monopoly and the ability to limit production, you instead reward them with a contract to purchase enough for the whole world. And that I think there's a lot of attractive theoretical properties of that. But as you mentioned, we actually had an opportunity to test this. I don't want to claim that everything was done perfectly, but the world decided to create an advanced market commitment. This was a bit over 10 years ago, more than a decade ago, for a vaccine against pneumococcus. So pneumococcus, it was killing 1.6 million people every year at the time. There were already vaccines against the strains common in high-income countries, but not against the strains common in low and middle-income countries. So a group of donors committed that if a vaccine were developed that was effective against the strains common in lower income countries, they would make $1.5 billion available to purchase it. Well, since then, 2 vaccines have been developed. Hundreds of millions of children have been vaccinated against this, and an estimated 700,000 lives have been saved. I think that this demonstrates that at least the feasibility of this type of advanced market commitment. And I think we could think about using this more broadly. There's some problems that's not well suited for, but I think we could do more of this. And an advantage of this is that if there's something when you don't know whether it's technologically possible, the government's not making the expenditure until the product's actually developed. And the government doesn't have to decide which technologies are the most promising, which companies to invest in. The companies make the decision whether to invest, and then they get rewarded if they succeed and not otherwise.
So are all these advanced market commitments reliable? There's been a lot of talk in Europe these last few days about a Brussels promise of purchase of a Austrian-French lab called Valneva. Things may change, but up to date, we're not sure they're going to purchase it in the long run. How can we make these reliable?
I think what's needed to be, I think if you just say we're going to do this, we're going to buy it, that's not going to be sufficient. I think what's needed is a legally binding contract, and that's what was in place for the pneumococcus example, and I think that's what would need to be in place for future advanced market commitments. Now, obviously we know sometimes governments have legally binding contracts and they don't follow them. But governments are often purchasing entering into very large contracts that go for many years, and typically, at least governments of high income countries, G7 governments, et cetera, do typically when they have a legal commitment, they typically follow through on that. So I don't want to claim this is riskless for a firm, but I think it's for many things this would be a level of commercial risk they'd be willing to accept. If they're not, then the government does have the alternative of just funding this up front and paying for the factory construction, and in some cases that may be appropriate as well.
Do we need a bad cop on this issue, like WHO or Gavi or I don't know who?
Sorry, I think I missed the beginning of the question.
Do we need a bad cop to make sure all the promises are kept? And would this bad cop be WHO or another organization?
I don't think that maybe you're more afraid of the WHO than I am, but I don't know whether there are sufficient. So maybe I'm misunderstanding what you mean by reliability. Are you talking about reliability of the government's promises to pay, or are you talking about reliability of the companies in delivering the product?
Let's talk about what you call NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions. So these are masks, air filters, closing of schools, as you mentioned earlier. Have you studied on what kind of solutions might be most beneficial? And can we develop clinical trials around this to maybe monetize it better or make things more efficient?
Okay. Well, let me just follow up on the bad cop idea. Look, if and this may not have been the question you're asking, but if you're trying to make sure that governments pay their bills, then I think you do need a bad cop, but the bad cop is probably not the WHO. The bad cop is to write the contract in a legally enforceable way, and there could potentially be various forms of making that. Of locking out funds in escrow. I don't think that's really necessary. I think high-income country governments typically do meet these legally binding commitments. There are other issues on the company. Are they going to fulfill their side? But let me turn to NPIs. So I think this is an area where we really did not do nearly as well as we should have. And in the short run, we have in the immediate when the COVID-19 first emerged. we didn't know, and it's understandable that we didn't know. We didn't know whether it was airborne. We didn't know whether the solution was we need to wipe down everything and all the surfaces, or whether we should set up filters, or whether we should be wearing masks, or do we stay 2 meters away from somebody? Um, and but we could have learned, or should we close down schools? So governments went to quite very tough measures like lockdowns. Now, I think that's totally understandable as a short run response. But I think long run, not even long run, I think if we had just invested a bit more in learning about the most effective prevention strategies, we could have had what happened was we had a lot of social division in many countries where governments were imposing various types of restrictions. Some segment of the population was very opposed to them. I think if we had developed knowledge and tried to learn much more quickly about what approaches were effective and what approaches weren't, we could have avoided some types of measures to prevent the spread of infection, like school closures, that probably were not very effective and that were extremely socially costly. And we could have instead focused on other measures that would have been perhaps much more effective and less costly. Um, and only now, this is very strange to report, but only very recently do we have good trials on what the impact of masks are. These don't require telling people you can't wear a mask to do a trial. That wouldn't be ethical. But simply by more strongly encouraging some people and investing in free distribution and more intensive communications, we were able to do trials to see. I say we, the world, and particular researchers. I certainly wasn't involved in this, but we were able to learn what the impact of masking was, and it makes a contribution. It's relatively low cost, and that's something that we could have done much more of. There's a lot of variation in which some areas closed schools, some didn't. We could have done much more active steps to learn what the impact of school closures was faster, and had much better policies as a result.
Have you
I don't
been
think there's a way to make much money from this. I think governments have to pay for it.
have you been able in any way or in any sense to sort them out, these NPIs, or prioritize which ones were more beneficial?
So, I'm not a scientist, but I can tell you my layperson's understanding of the science. One thing I think is very clear: we put a lot of effort early on, thinking that we needed to wipe down surfaces and so on. This was clearly airborne, and so things like masks work. And I think we have, my reading of the studies on that is now positive. Schools, I think the consensus, I don't think we have perfect evidence on this, but I think the consensus of opinion is that school closures are probably not that effective against the pandemic, but they're very, very costly to children. So I think we should have, in retrospect, we probably should have had a different balance of policies. But the lesson for the future isn't what worked against COVID-19. The lesson is, let's have resources available so that as soon as we get the next pandemic, we can immediately start learning what are the most effective prevention measures, what we can immediately start testing a bunch of drugs to see whether existing drugs might work against us, that we develop diagnostics, and as I've said, that we work to rapidly develop and then very rapidly test vaccines.
One thing I believe you did work on is what you call dose stretching. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think you have even said that if we had stretched a little bit more of the doses, we would have doubled the supply, which means getting more people vaccinated.
Sure. Let me give some more context and perhaps qualify that a bit, or definitely qualify that a bit. But I see where you're going here. The So first is background. Anytime that somebody's a pharmaceutical firm or biotech firm is developing a vaccine, there's a question of what's the right dosage. And often there's considerable effort that goes into establishing the right dose. And there may be a trade-off. If you have too much, maybe you get more side effects. If you don't have enough, maybe it's not effective. Now, sometimes, as in the pandemic, you had to make some decisions very early on because we were rushing to get a vaccine out as quickly as possible. And so they made some decisions, and then pharmaceutical companies don't necessarily want to go. They get regulatory approval for something, they don't want to go back and reopen that question. But from a social point of view, particularly during a pandemic where we need to vaccinate people as quickly as possible, if there is a possibility that a lower dose would have been just as effective, it's very important to find that out. Or perhaps even more equally effective, but fewer side effects, so might even get adopted. And just to give a sense of the magnitude, you mentioned doubling. For yellow fever epidemic, the Brazil, there are multiple cases like this, but Brazil cut doses with WHO's blessing. They cut doses to 1/5 the level. So they could produce they could have 5 times the number of doses available. And that turned out to be quite effective. So you can sometimes get many more doses produced by changing the dose. So it's not that we know for sure that smaller doses would have been effective. And that's where I'd qualify the statement a little bit. I won't get into the technical details, but there's some initial data suggesting that perhaps lower doses would have been very effective. Now, not enough to say we definitely should have done that, but enough to say that we should have invested in testing that. But instead we didn't. Why? The payoff for the vaccine company is very low, but the payoff for society could be very huge. So it's worth it for society as a whole to say, hey, we're going to finance the tests to try to get, maybe we go ahead with production of what we know works, but simultaneously, in parallel, let's do the testing to see if we can use a lower dose. And if it turns out we can, then the vaccine can reach many more people much more quickly.
Michael, to wrap it up, if you had to make a to-do list of everything we've mentioned, what would be your top 2? What would be your top 2? And second question, lessons from the pandemic. Are there any lessons we can have that might help us tomorrow to have a vaccine for Ebola or HIV, which we still do not have?
Yes. So one lesson would be we've built a lot of capacity for COVID-19 vaccines. Now, right now, and that's mRNA capacity, and mRNA vaccines could potentially be used for many other things. So we could let that capacity shut down, and indeed, unfortunately, South African facility was built to produce COVID-19 vaccine, and there's no demand for it, and it is shutting down. And the equipment will be used for other things. The workers who are trained to produce this will go off to do other things, and we will lose that capacity. So number one lesson is let's make sure that we keep capacity on standby, and that if that means paying that South African factory, but I don't just mean the South African factory. If that means keeping this open and on standby, perhaps producing other things as long as we can get it back to vaccine production quickly if we need it. That's an expense that's worth making. The second lesson is we need to invest much more in a whole set of research to make sure that you'll never make sure, but to increase the likelihood that when we have the next pandemic, we're ready, that we can rapidly test many drugs, many possible vaccine candidates, and many diagnostic and devices as well. So I would say the R&D and the capacity are the two lessons I would draw from this.
I have a problem with my mic. Yeah. Michael, thank you very much for being with us, for your comments, for your analysis, and some clues and suggestions on what we can do to be better prepared tomorrow. We had labs with us this morning. I hope they heard you. I hope governments maybe are listening to you. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks again, and this ends our first day of the Common Good Summit. Stay tuned tomorrow. We will talk about urban transportation, the risk of AI, digital, and what maybe awaits the new French government, the new French president, and the new PM, Elisabeth Borne. Until then, have a nice evening, have a nice day.